Baseball, rate and plus statistics.
Hey, this is the second video in a 5-part comprehensive guide to baseball statistics. This video covers rate stats, like on-base percentage and ERA, and plus stats, which are a newer category of stat that ultimately makes things easier for fans. If you haven't watched the first video in this series, which covered counting stats, you might want to do that first. The counting stats covered in that video are the building blocks of the rate stats in this video, and I won't be doing any review. The link to the first video is on your screen now. Rate stats are foundational to baseball, and the idea to keep track of these types of statistics dates back to the earliest days of baseball record keeping. Even if you're the most casual baseball fan, you are familiar with batting average and ERA, and you probably are at least somewhat aware of more modern stats like OPS. Rate stats can seem arcane at first, but ultimately, these types of stats exist to answer specific questions that you might have about baseball players and teams. For example, how often does a specific player get on base? There's a stat for that. Which pitchers are the most successful at keeping runners off the base paths? There's a stat for that, too. Maybe you want a stat that simplifies the process of comparing players to one another, and you want this stat to be presented in an extremely simple way that literally anyone can understand. There's actually an entire category of that type of stat. This video dives pretty deep, and I've been advised that it's at least a couple levels more intense than most of my videos, which tend not to be that intense. I've tried to balance information for the casual fan with the more explicit mathematical stuff, but this video is unapologetically dense, so you've been warned. I've tried to create the video that I wish had existed when I was really getting into baseball. With this all out of the way, let's start talking about these rate stats. At their core, most baseball rate stats are simply fractions, with some combination of one or more baseball events in the numerator and another combination of one or more baseball events in the denominator, sometimes modified by coefficients. Usually they're expressed as decimal numbers, but sometimes they're expressed as percentages. Some rate stats are comprehensive and are intended to tell a relatively thorough story about a player's achievement as a hitter or pitcher, while others are specific and are intended to provide insight into a single facet of a player's performance. You don't necessarily need to be great at math in order to understand rate stats. As long as you know what a specific stat measures and what is considered an average, good, and poor number for that statistic, you're probably good. To this end, I've included a rough scale for each stat that shows what a poor, below average, average, above average, great, and elite performance looks like at the major league level. Poor represents the lowest end of what you can expect to see from an everyday major league player, whereas elite represents the numbers you can expect from the top maybe 2 or 3 players within whatever time frame you're looking at. I want to say with emphasis that these ranges can and do change from year to year. Even though I'm confident in these scales for the purposes of this video, they might be out of date by the time you watch this. That's just the nature of baseball statistics. I've based these scales primarily on the past 12 seasons with a heavy bias towards the past 4 seasons. I also want to make it clear, again with emphasis, that each statistic in this video only tells one part of a player's story. There is no single rate stat that is designed to give a complete picture of how a player performs and exists as a baseball player. One final thing. Because rate stats can have any number of baseball events and coefficients in their numerators and denominators, there's literally an infinite number of possible baseball rate stats. We obviously won't be able to cover an infinite number of stats in this video, so if I leave out your favorite rate stat, feel free to leave it as a comment. I'll address any glaring omissions in the final video of this series. All right, let's begin with batting rate stats. The most commonly used batting rate stats are the ones that address some combination of how often a player gets on base, how many bases a player gets per at-bat, and the rates at which players walk or strike out. Batting rate stats are generally expressed as decimal numbers, but they are almost always spoken of as if they are whole numbers without the decimal point. This holds true for stats that can go above 1.0. For example, OPS. If a player has an OPS of 1.100, we don't say they have an OPS of 1.1, we say they have an OPS of 1100. Let's start with the most common batting rate stats. Batting average is a measure of how often a batter gets a hit per at-bat. Batting average is the traditional batting rate stat, dating back to the earliest days of baseball record keeping. And for most of baseball history, batting average was pretty much the only rate stat used for batters. Batting average is calculated by dividing the number of hits that a player gets by their total number of at-bats. So for example, if a batter gets a hit 25% of their at-bats, then their batting average will be 250. And the mean among Major League Baseball players for batting average tends to be just a little bit above 250. A batting average of 200 is considered poor, and this line of demarcation, a batting average of 200, is sometimes called the Mendoza line, named after a former baseball player named Mario Mendoza. Batting average is still used by the baseball mainstream as one way to measure a batter's performance. However, batting average has some limitations that make it a less than ideal statistic for really evaluating a player's offensive output. One of these limitations is that batting average does not include walks, which today are recognized as a key component to a player's offensive output. Another limitation is that batting average treats every hit the same way. So, a hit recorded on a goofy-looking play in the first inning and a game-winning home run in extra innings both have the same impact on a player's batting average. Let's take a look at some of the more modern and descriptive stats that are supplementing and even replacing batting average these days. On-base percentage, sometimes known as on-base average, is the rate at which a player safely reaches base. Because it includes walks and hits by pitch, it has largely replaced batting average as the stat to use when determining how often a player reaches base. It's commonly believed that on-base percentage uses plate appearances as the denominator, but as you can see, this is not precisely true. Most plate appearances are included, but on-base percentage does not include errors, and it does not include sacrifice bunts. It does include sacrifice flies. Slugging percentage is a measure of how many bases a player reaches per at-bat. It is calculated the same way as batting average, except instead of adding a 1 to the numerator each time the player gets a hit, the total number of bases reached on that hit is added to the numerator. The highest possible slugging percentage is 4,000, but it's rare for a batter to have a slugging percentage above about 650. Batting average, on-base percentage, and slugging are frequently expressed together in the form that you see on your screen right now. This is called the triple slash. On-base percentage and slugging both improve upon batting average, but they each leave out what makes the other one an improvement. On-base percentage does not record the number of bases that a player reaches for each plate appearance, and slugging does not include walks or hit by pitches or sacrifice flies. So in 1984, a new stat came on the scene that combined these two statistics in a simple and surprisingly elegant way. On-base plus slugging, or OPS. By simply adding a player's on-base percentage to their slugging percentage, you arrive at a number that is actually a really good measure of a batter's all-around performance at the plate. Unlike some other advanced stats that we'll be covering throughout this series, OPS has caught on with the baseball mainstream and is rapidly becoming the de facto default batting statistic. I like OPS for a number of reasons. For one, it's pretty easy to describe. Also, Major League OPS is distributed in such a way that allows for a pretty easy delineation between poor, average, above average, great, and elite. We know that anything around 600 is poor, around 700 is average, around 800 is above average, around 900 is great, and anything 1,000 or above would be considered elite. As solid as OPS is as like the baseline basic hitting statistic for baseball, OPS is not as precise as it could be in terms of measuring how much a batter contributes to run scoring. And this makes sense because its components, on-base percentage and slugging, are not designed to measure a player's impact on run scoring. For example, in slugging percentage, a home run is worth 4 times as much as a single. However, when you run the numbers, you find that a home run, on average, leads to about 2 to 2.5 times as many runs as a single. And in on-base percentage, a walk and a single are both worth the same. But a single is ultimately more valuable because a single is a ball in play, which obviously can advance base runners and lead to more runs. So if you're interested in seeing how batters are doing in terms of how many runs their offensive output would be worth on average, there is a stat for you. Weighted on-base average, or wOBA. In wOBA, each possible outcome of a plate appearance is given a specific value, and this value acts as a coefficient in the numerator of the equation. These weights themselves are based on how much each outcome contributes to run scoring, which actually changes slightly from year to year. And wOBA is scaled to on-base percentage. So if you know it's a good on-base percentage, then you know it is a good wOBA. The website Baseball Reference publishes a modified version of wOBA that they called rOBA, which makes a number of improvements to wOBA. These include separating infield hits and outfield hits into separate sets of variables with their own weights, and including grounds into double play into the calculation. rOBA, or reference wOBA, or whatever people are going to end up calling it, is a brand new statistic, but it seems to have the blessing of the person who invented wOBA. So if you want to be on the bleeding edge of baseball statistics, this is the linear batting stat for you. Now let's take a look at some batting stats that are not necessarily useful on their own, but help tell a more complete story of a player's plate performance. Isolated power, or ISO, is slugging percentage minus batting average. So it's a measure of how many extra bases a player gets per at-bat. ISO has historically been used as a measure of a batter's pure power, but it has enough limitations that I would not recommend using it for this purpose. ISO is most useful as a tool to supplement batting average when determining how players are performing at the plate. For example, let's say batter A has a batting average of 257 with an ISO of 335, while player B has a batting average of 282, but an ISO of only 127. If you're looking solely at batting average, you might assume that player B is doing better at the plate. But by taking ISO into consideration, we see that player A is actually having a monster year at the plate as a power hitter, even though a 257 batting average is only about average. A player's walk-to-strikeout ratio is used as a measure of plate discipline. A player with a higher walk-to-strikeout ratio is better at identifying pitches outside the strike zone and is probably more likely to get on base. Players with low walk-to-strikeout ratios are not necessarily bad hitters. In fact, some of the more powerful hitters frequently also strike out a great deal, so they wind up near the bottom of this statistic. For example, in the 2021 season, the best walk-to-strikeout ratio was Juan Soto, with a towering 1.56 walks per strikeout. Soto finished the year with a 313 batting average and a 999 OPS. Meanwhile, Tyler O'Neill ranked near the bottom with 0.23 walks per strikeout, but still finished the season tied for 10th in the majors for OPS with an OPS of 912. So walk-to-strikeout ratio is a measure of a batter's discipline, not necessarily their overall production as a hitter. Batting average on balls in play, or BABIP, is a measure of how often a ball in play lands for a hit. BABIP does not necessarily measure how good a batter is, although players with higher BABIPs are usually better than players with lower BABIPs. Instead, BABIP is used as a supplemental stat to determine if a player is producing offense at a sustainable rate. This explanation is a bit heady, so stick with me. According to Fangraphs, balls in play tend to go for hits about 30% of the time, and a player's skill can only affect that figure by about 5% in either direction. The other factors that determine whether a ball in play is a hit are defensive skill and luck. And because these things are out of a batter's control, players' BABIP can be looked at alongside their current and historical batting stats to get a more complete picture of how sustainable their current batting performance may be. It should be made clear that BABIP does not exist in a bubble, and as I said, good players tend to have higher BABIPs to begin with. All right, that's it for the main batting rate stats that we will be covering in this video. Before we go on to rate stats for pitchers, this is a good time to talk about sample size. If your middle school math class was similar to mine, you might remember a lesson where your teacher had everyone in the class flip a coin and tally the number of heads and tails that were tossed. If they had you flip the coin 20 times, maybe a few kids had the expected result, which is 10 heads and 10 tails. But most kids had something like 11 of one and 9 of the other, or maybe 12 of one and 8 of the other. One or two kids might have even had something like 15 tails and only 5 heads from their 20 coin flips. And if you looked only at your own 20 flips and saw, for example, 12 heads and 8 tails, you might assume that flipping a coin is an activity that yields more heads than tails. However, once the class pooled all their answers together, the total result of this activity was probably much closer to what would be expected, which is about a 50-50 split between heads and tails. Baseball stats are the same way. Small sample sizes often produce statistics that are not very useful and that are not indicative of how a player is actually performing in a given season or across a given amount of time. To illustrate this, I created a computer program that more or less simulates the offensive production of 2021 Jose Ramirez. And in 2021, Jose Ramirez had a batting average of 266 and an OPS of about 900. When I set the number of plate appearances to 20 and run the simulation a bunch of times, I get a range of OPSs that stretches from impossibly low to impossibly high and hits everywhere in between. 2021 was a good year for Jose Ramirez, who is consistently one of the better hitters in the major leagues. But there are stretches of 20 plate appearances in the simulation where Jose Ramirez's simulated OPS barely even cracks 200. But when I set the number of plate appearances to 350, the range of OPSs narrows to where pretty much every time I run the simulation, the stats look like what you might expect from an above average to elite hitter having a good season. Now, the purpose here is not to make some sort of claim that baseball players are simulations, so please don't go there in the comments. I just want to discourage you from reading too much into statistics when the sample size is small. Situations where it's tempting to read too much into small sample sizes include the beginning of a season, or when a player returns from injury, or when a player gets traded to your favorite team, etc. I can't begin to pretend to understand all of the math that goes into figuring out how many plate appearances need to happen before you can start trusting a stat, but there are people who have figured this out, and I've linked to an article in the description that should serve as a good starting point if that's a rabbit hole you want to go down. All right, let's go on to pitching rate stats. Much like batting rate stats, pitching rate stats are just a fraction where there's some combination of baseball events in the numerator and some combination of baseball events in the denominator. However, unlike batting rate stats, with pitching rate stats, the lower number is almost always better. Because on the pitching side of the ball, you are trying to limit things like hits. You want fewer hits, you want fewer runs, you want fewer walks, etc. Let's start with the most common pitching rate stat, ERA. Earned run average, or ERA, is the default pitching statistic and is what you should assume if you see a decimal number next to a pitcher's name without any other explanation. ERA measures the number of earned runs that a pitcher would be responsible for on average in a 9-inning game. Like batting average, ERA dates back to the earliest days of baseball record keeping. But unlike batting average, which has been surpassed by stats that measure a batter's production more precisely or completely, ERA is still widely used because it measures what it's designed to measure pretty much perfectly. It also does so in an easy to remember way, right? An ERA in the 3s is generally a good ERA. Anything in the 2s or below is exceptionally good. And anything above a 5 is probably not where you want to be as a major league pitcher. Walks and hits per inning pitched, or WHIP, is a measure of a pitcher's ability to limit base runners. WHIP is a straightforward stat that's used alongside ERA to get a more complete picture of a pitcher's performance. Fielding independent pitching, or FIP, is a statistic designed to measure a pitcher's performance independent of the performance of their team's defense. The idea of FIP is that a pitcher can really only control walks, strikeouts, hits by pitch, and home runs. And a team's defense has at least some part to play in any other type of hit or any other result from a plate appearance. So FIP is designed to be the statistic that measures a pitcher's performance on its own, without any other external factors. FIP is designed to align with the same basic range as ERA, so a good FIP is basically the same thing as a good ERA. There is a modified version of FIP called xFIP, which replaces home runs in the formula with fly balls multiplied by the rate at which fly balls go for home runs in a given season across the major leagues. This is super heady, but the idea here is that home runs are as much a product of the ballpark that the pitcher is pitching in as they are a product of a pitcher's skill. So if you're really trying to just measure the pitcher and not any sort of other factors, you should look to the number of fly balls that the pitcher gives up and multiply that by the rate at which fly balls go for home runs. If this makes sense to you, then xFIP is probably the version of FIP that you will want to use. Runs allowed per 9 innings pitched, or RA9, is basically ERA with the E removed. A run allowed for a pitcher is any run scored by a runner who reaches base while the pitcher is on the mound, regardless of how the runner got on base. The idea behind using RA9 instead of ERA is that a pitcher's job is ultimately to limit runs. So it's a sign of a good pitcher if they can limit the runs that they are quote-unquote responsible for and the runs that they are not quote-unquote responsible for. The stats we've talked about so far, ERA, WHIP, runs allowed over 9, and FIP and xFIP can be used together to get a fairly comprehensive picture of how a pitcher is doing. I would advise against treating any one of these as the single stat to trust when evaluating a pitcher. BABIP, which you'll remember from earlier in this video, is also a pitching stat, and you can use it the same way as a batter's BABIP. So if a pitcher's BABIP over a specific range of time is significantly higher or lower than their career BABIP, there's a good chance that their numbers and overall performance will not be sustained at whatever the current rates are. And just like with batters, certain pitchers naturally produce lower BABIPs, so this is not a statistic that exists in a bubble. Finally, let's look at single stat rates for pitchers. Traditionally, if you wanted to find the pitcher who's best at, for example, getting batters to strike out, you'd just count the number of strikeouts and see which pitcher struck out the most batters. However, pitching has changed a lot since the early days of baseball record keeping, and these days it's generally accepted that comparing rate stats for most counting stats is the better way to determine which pitchers are doing the best over a given span of time. There are two basic ways of turning a single counting stat into a rate stat. You can look at each stat as a percentage of total plate appearances, or you could do it per 9 innings. Doing it per 9 innings puts it on the same scale as most other pitching stats. Doing it as a percent of overall plate appearances is ultimately more precise. Just a warning, all of these rate stats are extremely affected by sample size, and the ranges seem to vary greatly over time. Let's start with strikeout rates, which are on your screen now. Strikeout rates have shot up enormously over the past 15 seasons and seem to increase with each season. Because of this, these were the most difficult scales to make, and these are the ones I would predict might be out of date the quickest. Now here are the rates for home runs. Again, these have shot up quite a bit over the past few seasons. As pitchers are striking out more batters are hitting more home runs. So these ranges might be out of date by the time you watch this video. Finally, here are the rates for walks. These have been more stable than strikeout rates and home run rates over the past 10 or 15 seasons, but these ranges will change from year to year. So treat what you're looking at on your screen as a general guide. All right. That's it for the pitching stats that we're going to cover in this video. As with the batting stats, there are dozens and dozens of other stats out there that people use. So if I left out your favorite stat, leave it as a comment. I'll be addressing any glaring omissions in the final video of this series. Finally, let's talk about plus stats. Plus stats are season and ballpark adjusted stats that are designed to make it easy to compare players to their peers and also to historical players. Ballpark adjusted means that each event is adjusted slightly based on the ballpark it happened in. For example, the Oakland Coliseum, with its wide foul area and relatively deep outfield, is known to be a pitcher-friendly park. So a home run in Oakland is weighted higher than a home run at Coors Field in Colorado, where the low atmospheric pressure of the Rocky Mountains sends balls flying out of the park at a much higher rate than average ballparks. Plus stats are calculated in a way where 100 is always the league average at a given point in a season, and where the number above or below 100 is the percentage above or below average that the player is. So a player with an OPS plus of 120 has an adjusted OPS that is 20% higher than MLB average. A player with an OPS plus of 80 has an adjusted OPS that's 20% lower than average. Plus stats make it easy to compare players to their peers, but also to players across eras. For example, in 1999, Pedro Martinez had a strikeout percentage of 37.5%. In 2021, Jacob deGrom had a strikeout percentage of 45.1%. If you looked just at the numbers, you might think that 2021 deGrom was the more dominant pitcher in this area, even though a 37.5 strikeout rate is ridiculously good and would be ridiculously good in any era. But when you look at their strikeout percent plus, you see that Pedro Martinez had a strikeout percent plus of 239, while deGrom had a strikeout percent plus of only 193, and I put only in quotations here, even though deGrom's actual strikeout percent was almost 8 full percentage points higher than Pedro Martinez's. This is because strikeout rates have increased across the board. So deGrom was actually closer to the average of his peers with 45.1% than Pedro Martinez was with 37.5%. So plus stats are incredibly useful and incredibly easy to use. The most common plus stats that you'll see are OPS plus, ERA plus, FIP plus, and WRC plus, which is the plus stat based on wOBA. But you can turn any stat into a plus stat, and the website Fangraphs has an entire leaderboard page just of the plus stats of the various stats you might be interested in looking up. All right, that's it for this video on baseball rate stats. If you've made it all the way to the end, you will probably enjoy the rest of the videos in this series, and you'll probably enjoy the other videos that I upload to YouTube. So please give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. I don't think you'll be disappointed with the content that I put out. One more time, if you think I have missed an important stat, leave it in the comments, and I will address any glaring omissions in the final video of this series. The next video in this series covers defensive metrics, and if it's completed, you will see it on your screen now.